Everybody, it's my pleasure to be today and to visit you and to talk to you and to give you a bit of introduction and talk about learning analytics, a new emerging field. So, we are really living in great times for education. It's a growing demand for education. We, of course, knew all these things. We knew that many are increasing needs for their educational opportunities. However, the last 2-3 years, we saw a big shift in the mainstream media in terms of the coverage of education. We saw that education all of a sudden became the hype. We saw that education became something that everybody started talking about. We recently did analysis of the overall MOOC hype in the mainstream media. And we basically decided to analyze the last 4 years up until June this year, everything which was happening in the mainstream media with respect to the public discourse about MOOCs. What we found is actually out of the top 20 major publishers, 3 of them were from Australia. So although I was not perhaps so aware that this topic was so important and so big in Australia, that was actually very well reflected in our data. The other thing is out of the top 30 topics that we identified that were discussed about issues of MOOCs and MOOC technology, 5th most popular topic was MOOCs in Australia. Out of all these other topics, such as accreditation of MOOCs, recognition of MOOCs, retention, even more important, retention. So MOOCs in Australia were just slightly behind these 4 major MOOC providers there. But what MOOCs actually brought us into the picture? They brought us one single thing. They brought us actually that we can use technology for education. Well, at least they increased the public awareness. We knew that. But the other important thing is, at least the MOOCs, how they were publicized in the mainstream media, actually showed us that we can scale education. And we, of course, can scale because in some pedagogical models, class sizes don't matter, right? However, when we increase these big class sizes, there's a big challenge for us. What we are doing there is we are basically diminishing these feedback loops that may exist between students and educators. And therefore, there is a need to close this loop in the process so that students can get personalized type of a feedback, and we can also understand how they are approaching learning and how we can then change and adjust our teaching. However, how we can do that? Offering students questionnaires, perhaps, could be a good idea. However, we need to wait the end of the term and then ask them for some feedback. So the idea for us was when we started the work on learning analytics, and this is a slide I'm already using, I showed it many times in the last 7-8 years, is basically that we, in most of institutions, have 2 major technological components. We basically start our process by creating our courses, and we are using a piece of technology which is typically in many institutions LMS. It became commodity. No single university, I think, at least mainstream, doesn't have some sort of learning management system. The other thing we always had traditionally is student information systems. We had to record the grades of our students. We had to record the enrollments of students inside of these different types of systems. So what is important to understand, no matter what we do with these types of technologies, we are leaving digital footprint. We are leaving digital trace. And that digital trace is something that we can analyze. But many instructors are actually not limited just to think in terms of these 2 silos. Many of them are trying to innovate. So some of us are trying to use social networking technology so that we basically engage students to connect only with their internal class, but also connected with the broader world, so that their problems can be then of a greater value and also be able to access to the knowledge and expert sources that they could not otherwise access easily inside of their limited small networks. Again, in many cases, we really want to improve information-seeking skills. Gregor did some interesting work in terms of the weaknesses our students have in information-seeking skills. We also want to increase the level of self-reflection of how students use blogs, etc. So no matter which bit and piece of these technologies we are using, we are creating big digital trace. So what we are trying to do with learning analytics, we are trying to leverage these digital traces that are being created by our daily use of these technologies to apply different types of data mining, machine learning, and even traditional conventional statistical modeling algorithms, also combined with different types of visualizations, and then provide educators with a different type of feedback about understanding of their students' learning as well as learners as well about their learning, with the hope that this will increase the quality of our learning and teaching processes and consequently increase the quality of the learning of our learners. So this is the big picture about the learning analytics. So what are some of the lessons learned and what are the challenges? So this is the solution which is developed at Purdue University in the US. It is called Course Signals. It started from the same assumption that I showed you earlier today. It started from the assumption that we have a learning management system and we have a student information systems. And then based on that, they decided, well, inside of and they first piloted in their engineering school. They said, okay, cool, we have these two major systems. They are providing us with about 60, 70 different types of variables that we can measure. Students' page hits, students' number of messages that they posted, the amount of time they spend on their tasks, etc. And then they combine that with students' GPA, socioeconomic variables, etc. And then they basically decide to have one outcome variable, which is a categorical variable, had three outputs. Student at risk to fail the course, student at medium risk to fail a course, and student not at risk at all. And what they decided to do with these three categories, they simply translated them into three traffic lights. Out of that, they created a dashboard board for both for students and instructors, and they could see basically these alerts about student status, whether students are about to fail or not. They reported many different results, how this whole system increased significantly retention for those students who took at least one course which used this particular piece of software. And this is the whole general story. However, they later on, they introduced the system in 2007. They tracked it longitudinally, the group of students for 4 years. However, later on, they decided to see, well, okay, this is fine. We produce this great system. We are reporting some of these longitudinal studies and some of these results. Some of those results have been challenged recently in terms of the validity of the ways how they evaluated it, but there is really no doubt that it had certain positive effect. However, they decided to analyze the type of feedback that was triggered by instructors based on these different types of alerts that they were receiving from the Course Signals. So what they decided to do was to perform content analysis of the messages that instructors sent to their students. And the content analysis showed that the introduction of this piece of technology just increased the number of summative feedback types that students receive inside of the semester. So instead of having one or two summative feedback inside of the semester, students would be all of a sudden receiving weekly, you're not doing well, you may fail the course. And of course, logically, they found no association between the amount of these type of feedback with student success. Why? Because students typically know that they are not doing well, but it is a matter of how they can go from that point that they don't know how that they are not doing well, what is the instruction that we can help them with. And of course, they found that the number of instructive and formative feedback types was significantly associated with the student's outcome, right? So that makes my major point that the learning analytics need to be very careful in terms of the types of the tools that can provide something which is extremely important, actionable insight. Actionable insight, yeah, sure, it is important that I know that some of my students are at risk, but what can I do there? What instruction I can provide to my students so that I can better scaffold their learning? That's the major challenge that learning analytics needs to solve, in my opinion. The other issue is, well, that's fine, but I provided all these positions with respect to the type of data that we are using when we are analyzing students' interactions. And in most of cases, it's really the counts of page hits or the number of messages students saw. And then the whole point is then correlating those with the grades. Sure, but correlating two things, we can do many and we can find many random correlations. So if we don't know what that particular type of even page hit measures, then what is the interpretation? How that can be translated into the practice and research of learning and teaching. I mean, this is one of these funny examples that we can find certain types of correlations. That the murder rate in the US was positively associated with the use of Internet Explorer. But that really means nothing, right? Is it really, can this now, based on this, the US government make any new policy? Yeah, don't use Internet Explorer. Well, I can tell you that even without this. But let's not talk about that. There is another problem, which is commonly associated with learning analytics, and that is that many people, when you start talking about learning analytics, it is students' retention. That's fine. That's a valid point. But that's only, first of all, one single learning outcome. And that learning outcome is not necessarily always associated with learning at all, right? So if we are talking about learning analytics, then we need to talk about learning. And talking about this single outcome, in most of cases, we are talking about something else. We are talking about analytics, but that analytics is called academic analytics, which is typically associated with different types of academic affairs. So what is the type of direction that I want to suggest and that I'm basically taking in most of different types of studies that we are doing? Basically, the major point that I want to make is that we need to take the process and context focus for learning analytics. So we need to analyze the different types of learning processes and the context in which that learning happens. Whether we are talking about the space, like this one, whether we are talking about the instructional conditions in which certain things are happening, or whether we are talking about different types of technologies and the affordances that these technologies are offering. This is something without which we cannot develop and spend time into analytics because we will have meaningless interpretations. Therefore, the major proposition, although I understand that this statement is an oxymoron, it should be assumed, but learning analytics is about learning. And when I say this, I really want to point out that learning analytics as the new field cannot be divorced from what we already know about education, learning, and teaching. That is to say, learning analytics needs to be strongly informed by and should inform educational and research in the field of learning sciences. So one possible direction out of all is that takes certain types of views that what we know about learning. When I say about learning, so this is one view. Obviously, summarizing what we know about learning is really absolutely impossible in a single talk, even in a single book or a series of books. However, there are certain things that are emerging and that are well documented in different fields of education, such as educational psychology. One of them is documented by Phil Winnie, who basically summarized or identified three major axioms that are commonly understood by many researchers in the field of education, not necessarily by all of them. But I'm going to point out to two major ones, which are of relevance for our discussion today, although the third one is also highly relevant, but anyways. So the first one is that learners construct knowledge. That basically means that we always use certain tools when we are studying. And what we are doing there is, when I'm talking about tools, we are using different types of cognitive tools. Those tools could be, for example, reading. Those tools could be note-taking. Those tools could be also discussions. If I want to build a better argument, if I want to shape out my critical thinking. But it's very important to say that we are using these tools to create products of our learning. And those products of learning is whether we are talking about memory recall, whether we are talking about the level of the critical argument that I was able to produce, or whether we are talking about different other types of learning outcomes in terms of creativity. The second important point in this process is, while we are producing these, and when we are using these tools, it is the learners who are making decisions which of these tools will be used or not. We know from the research in self-regulated learning, as well documented, for example, by Robert Bjork, that in most of cases, students are using very ineffective study tactics when they are studying. For example, most of students are using reading and rereading when they are studying certain material, instead of, for example, self-testing, trying to basically see what are those points where they don't know or what they need to improve. That's the important thing. So we need to use and account for these two important things. Now, when we are analyzing then learning analytics, there is one potential framework that could be used in this process. And I think it nicely summarizes some of these points that I was already making. First of all, when we are talking about different types of tools, we are talking about the operations that we are performing when we are operating over raw information we are dealing with. So for example, I have a piece of text or I have a video information, and I'm operating on that video annotation. Perhaps that video is my own performance that I perform. So what I want to do is I want to reflect and identify weaknesses in my, say, musical performance. So in that process, I need to use certain operations. However, it is the products that are reflecting what I learned in this process. So for example, if I was looking my own performance, say I'm playing the guitar, although I don't. I'm not really talented at all. So I will have many points to say there. But it is the products that I need to analyze there. So what I reflected there, which points in my performance I identified as weak or not. The other thing, which is really essential, is then what types of standards did I use when I was evaluating my own performance? Was I able to identify all the weak points in my course or not? Did I have these standards already internalized in me? Or actually my instructor recognized, well, perhaps Dragan doesn't have really strong prior knowledge, and Dragan really doesn't have strong metacognitive monitoring skills. Therefore, I'm going to provide Dragan with a small scaffold, which would be a rubric. What I want him to actually tell me inside of his annotations of the video that I want him to do. And this is the standards that I'm going to use then to evaluate my own products of learning. Why this is important? Because if I'm highly inaccurate in judging my own learning products, I may stop studying even though I didn't master it well enough, right? This is really important to understand. And therefore, when we are interpreting these data in analytics, the other important thing is to understand conditions. And these conditions could be internal conditions. What I know about subject matter area, what is my level of prior knowledge, what is my epistemic belief about the particular topic that I'm studying, what is the level of my metacognitive skills, how I'm familiar with note-taking or self-reflection. If I'm not familiar, I won't see even the value to use it because I don't see that as an opportunity to improve my learning processes, right? The other thing is external conditions. What, for example, scaffolds my instructors provided me with, whether they also embedded the use of this particular study strategy inside of our instructional design or not. Those are the very important components that we need to account for so that we can make meaningful interpretations of learning analytics, but also even make any sense and even start designing any types of learning analytics. What most of research in learning analytics so far has done is complete obsessing over the analysis of operations. That's why we are just counting page hits. That's it. However, we need to move on from that obsession of the operations, and we need to move on to an understanding of products of learning, understanding of the conditions in which that learning happens, so that we can then better understand the standards that students use in evaluating their products of learning and also use for monitoring of their learning activities. I'm going to now give a few examples which will illustrate the importance of some of these claims that I made. So I'm going to now basically go through these different types of conditions, internal conditions and external conditions. So in many cases, we of course know that our instructional design is influencing students' learning. Why else we are doing instructional design? Why else we are providing scaffolds for students, right? In many cases, we are really forgetting that when we are analyzing data that we are getting, that we need to account for instructional design. Sorry, we are not forgetting in the educational research field. However, when we are entering the field which is so multidisciplinary, like the field of learning analytics, we are often forgetting because many are not really coming from the background who understand the importance of these points. Therefore, when we are actually accounting for these external conditions, we really need to see how those instructional conditions are moderating, for example, certain associations of, for example, students' products of learning with the measures of students' success. So, okay.
Technology file there. Sorry.
No worries. Good. So what we decided to do, we basically had a study in which we looked students which were using online discussion boards for interacting about their course materials. In particular, we performed this study in a very research-intensive course, master's level course, in a completely online condition, and the course was in software engineering. The whole paradigm that we use for design this whole course, but then also for the also design of the study was grounded in the framework which is called the community of inquiry, which is probably one of the best known frameworks in the field of online education. The community of inquiry has three major components which are shaping the learner's educational experience inside of an online collaborative learning activity. First one is our teaching presence. That's really our instructional design. But it can be also our direct instruction, or it could be our facilitation of online discussions, for example. The second component is so-called social presence. It's been shown in many studies that our instructional design should create conditions for students so that they feel comfortable enough to trust their peers to express freely their opinions, to share ideas, and to engage into the collaborative knowledge construction processes. Finally, once these conditions are established to both teaching and social presence, students can be engaged into cognitive presence. And cognitive presence in this particular model is defined as an inquiry process through the model which is called practical inquiry model. This model has 4 different phases, starting from my initial sense of puzzlement. I just basically had certain problem that I need to solve. I'm not sure how to solve it, and that is called triggering event. I basically share that puzzlement with the rest of the group. Then we start basically engaging and exploring different types of solutions. Someone basically shares a bit of information which could be useful to me. Other person jumps on and leaps into an incorrect conclusion. The other person shares some additional interesting ideas. And finally, some of us comes up with a really sound hypothesis which put together dots and connected different bits and pieces of information they found in the readings, they found somewhere online, and they also connected with their existing experience. Finally, once we have this sound hypothesis, we are testing this hypothesis in different types of vicarious examples. And eventually, inside of these examples, we also discover the conditions under which our solution could work, and that may eventually trigger some additional problems that we need to solve. So we could use these 4 phases for coding discussion messages when we are organizing our courses. So this is the instrument commonly used in this process. Not surprisingly, of course, we find and we identify in our studies, consistent with several other studies, that proper instructional guidance of students can increase the level of students' cognitive presence even up to 2.5 standard deviations, right? So we are pushing students to move away from these lower levels of cognitive presence into the upper levels of cognitive presence. But then there is another important thing. When we are now correlating the number of messages students submitted with the grades of students. In the cases when we had very ineffective instructional design, where we identified that students really did not have high level of cognitive presence, we found no associations with students' grades. Why? Because students' grades eventually we were measuring the level of critical thinking and synthesis of the newly constructed knowledge students had to put together inside of their courses. However, when we introduced the new study design, first of all, we saw huge increase in the level of cognitive presence, and we found significant associations with the particular types of assignments and particular phases of the cognitive presence. In our case, that was the phase of integration, which is consistently associated, which is also very interesting because these discussions happened in weeks 3 to 5 of a 12 weeks long course.
So they assignments, Dragon?
Pardon?
TMA 1, 2, 3, they're assignments.
They were basically really writing intensive assignments. Assignment 2 was a literature review paper. Assignment 3 was kind of a critical discussion of the questions that the instructor gave the students. And assignment 5 was basically a project, but then requested also to have a research paper produced in the end of that one. And there's basically another important point here, is that almost 25% of the students' variability for this intervention group, where we had high quality discussion, was explained by these discussions which happened in weeks 3 to 5, right? And more importantly, what was the reflection for us in that sense is that the lowest group with the lowest quality of their discussions almost all failed. And we could know that after 5 weeks of a 12 weeks course. And this is really reasonable. Why? Because we pushed students to discuss topics that they were about to then proceed in their and to pursue in their research projects later, right? And see, if they couldn't put together a good argument, they didn't have sufficient skills. But this is a now very qualitative insight that I get about my students. I can give them really meaningful guidance about the types of activities they need to engage. I can identify whether they are quickly leaping to conclusions, they are inadequately using literature, or they are also not really spending enough time and engagement in some of these discussions. That was also what was happening. There is another thing that we need to account. In the same study, in the same sample, we wanted also to check for internal conditions of students. And that is what types of decisions students are making. What is the level of metacognitive skills? This was done with the intention to show that we cannot really simply interpret counts of whatever types of activities or simple time and tasks without deep understanding that these different measures may have different meaning and interpretation for different subpopulations of our students. In particular, and I'm not sure whether you can see this graph, but I'll try to make the point of this. What we did is basically for our sample that we had, we applied cluster analysis. We used as the variables for our cluster analysis all these commonly used variables that are used in learning analytics. For example, the number of logins into the system, the number of messages, the number of time students saw assignment, or the number of time they saw certain resources. In addition, we also use time and task as well. Then we identify in our analysis 6 unique clusters. Those clusters are really, in terms of their characteristics, quite similar with several other previous studies. And in that sense, we can see that there's good validity of this cluster analysis. But then there's another important thing. I want you to pay attention to now 2 specific clusters, cluster 1 and cluster 4. According to some of these myths that are typically used in learning analytics field, this cluster 4 is spending enormous amount of time, especially checking out these assignments, etc., but also even inside the discussion. So this is really the group of students who is absolutely super active. And according to these analytics assumptions, often spelled out, these students are probably not at risk. And this cluster 1, they are performing under the average almost in any type of activity except the number of messages that they posted, but they are pretty much also where the rest of all other students are. Now, when we go and look into the outcomes of these students, we first of all could conclude that the self-assignment of these students into particular clusters ranged in terms of effect sizes both on their final grades as well as for the quality of their critical thinking and cognitive presence very, very highly, right? So those were the effect sizes which were between 0.4 to 2.5 standard deviations, depend which of these different types of measures we used. But the other important thing which we also observed here is now when we went on and looked into the quality of this discourse that students had inside of their discussions. So this is cluster 1. These darker bars are those that we really cared about. Integration, so that integration explained mostly the quality of the grades and the success of these students. But integration also explained the level of critical thinking these students had. So this was the cluster which hardly performed any time online. They were really under average, but they were top students in the class. Why? Well, my explanation, this is simply these students had high level of metacognitive knowledge, plus also high level of prior knowledge. Therefore, they were efficient learners and they didn't have to waste their time on studying. However, this other group of students, cluster 4, who were super engaged, they were all right. They passed the course, but they were all right, right? They struggled. They were highly motivated students, but they really didn't have probably both the level of metacognitive skills, how to discuss online, critical thinking skills, and also probably was also associated with the level of background knowledge they had on the particular field. All right, so now how we can integrate these 2 bits to points, internal and external conditions. And basically, we wanted to have another type of a study where we wanted to show that students are not always driven by only assessments. there's a common assumption that students will not use certain technology unless we force them to use it by grading students. So we are engaged into one project in which we are developing a piece of technology for video annotation. So students can watch videos, and then in any point in time, they can stop at a flag, which means they can add an annotation of their video. So it's a timestamp annotation, similar like taking highlights of a piece of text that you are reading, and you can also add annotations that would summarize the entire video. Very simple piece of technology. But then we wanted to use it at the University of British Columbia in their School of Music. In the School of Music, students are typically graded based on their performances. So we engage with 4 different courses which were on conducting. So students were asked to have a conducting performance inside of their classes. Their performances were recorded, and then eventually those recordings were uploaded into our software, and students were then requested to self-reflect on their own performance. And then we initially had students in 2 different semesters. So in semester 1, we had course 1 and course 2. In course 1, students were not graded, and they had sort of recommendation to use this software. But in the other software, in the other course, students were graded, and their self-reflections were basically checked by their instructors. So, as we could expect, the use of the technology in the graded condition, when they were not forced, which is quite consistent with what I already said. Like this is course 2, graded condition, on all these different types of operations, like the number of annotations, time watched, etc. We did also even some qualitative analysis. They were also quite similar. But then we noticed a slight tendency. Well, there's here a bar as well. Unfortunately, this projector doesn't show it because it's light. This is basically these two dark green bars. Those are the same students who took both courses at the same time. One thing which we noticed was that basically students who took both courses at the same time had a tendency in this other non-graded course to be always using the technology much more than these other students who were just taking only one course, which was not graded for them. Which is obviously some sort of reflection of the type of skills that they were gaining in this other course, how to use effectively this particular technology. However, this is the beauty of the natural experiment that we had. So this course 2 was a prerequisite course for students in the next semester to enroll into course 3, which was really almost similar type of subject domain, conducting, but now not anymore general conducting, which was conducting with choir. So students basically enrolled into this course, but only about half of the students in this course were those who took this course in the previous semester. And there was about other half of the students who took this course in some previous year when they didn't use this particular technology. So we wanted to see what was happening with our students when they persisted in the graded condition. The use of annotations almost doubled. The task conditions didn't change at all. So students simply continued to use technology double more without the request to do so, right? That was the first interesting observation. So this basically shows us that probably they were getting more and more effective with this learning strategy that they embraced in the previous course. However, the beauty of this study was that we could have another course 4, which was non-graded condition, which was run in parallel with this other course, which was a graded condition, and a similar composition of students. Half of them were taking the previous graded course. And this is something what we observed. These students who were in the graded condition here in the previous course, when they moved on to the non-graded condition, they preserved the level of the use and activity in the course. They were not graded anymore. They just maintained the same level. We did not observe any statistically significant differences. However, this bar is somewhere here. Those are the students who did not take this course before. They didn't have any previous experience with this particular study strategy. So they were obviously dropping, but they were still higher than the previous course when we just introduced the technology, right? So it was probably a reflection of the interaction with these other students who were more efficient learners. And this is basically common for almost every single point. But we said this is fine. This is fine in terms of the number of perform operations. Someone of you can say, sure, but then probably their annotations were different inside. Well, I can tell you one thing. the length of these messages when students were doing on their own, without any forced use, they were longer. They produced more text on average. So that's another thing. However, we wanted to do is to analyze what strategy actually our students use when they were going through these videos, right? So we decided to create something which we call transition graphs. So students, for example, can take an annotation in the first quartile of a video, the annotation, the second, third, and so on. Similarly, they can pause first, second, third, fourth quartile of a video, right? And also for all these other types of events. So what we decide to do is, for example, if a student poses in the first quartile of a video and then creates an annotation, we basically had two nodes in our graph and established a link between them. What we did is that we created these transition graphs for each individual student. We quickly realized, even just at the surface by looking at these graphs, that students in the graded condition, they connected many more dots, right? And when they were in non-graded condition, they were using different standards, and their graphs, at least at the surface, looked less dense. And indeed, when we applied the social network analysis measures, we measured the density of these graphs. You can see that the students who were in the graded condition always had much bigger density, right? That basically tells us about the standards students are using in their conditions, because they care so much that they don't miss any of the points inside of these videos, and they are closely connecting these different types of operations because they are evaluated. When they are not evaluated, they probably spotted all these mistakes and errors, but they don't really care if they missed really something small point because they will not be smacked because of that. The other important thing is in terms of the language, what language students use, is this point. We applied something which is called cometrics, which is used for text comprehension. It is used commonly, for example, in research for readability comprehension. To what extent, for example, to gauge to what extent certain text is suitable for kids in grade 1, 2, 3, or in different levels of university education. So what we observed was whenever students were graded, they used much more concrete language. They used also language which is acquired much earlier in their life. They used language which was much easier, like when I say certain words, which is much simpler to find the meaning of these words because they are kind of more concrete, right? However, students, when they were not graded, they used much more abstract language. Why? Because when I'm doing it on my own, I don't care if the person who I'm going to show my annotations will understand me or not. I really care just whether I am focusing on these processes and whether I am identifying these types of problems. The other important thing we also found is coherence of my narration. When I'm taking my own notes, they are really all over the place. They are my own thing. However, when I'm having the coherence of my notes when I'm presenting it to my instructor, no matter how informal this medium was that we were using annotations, they were still much more coherent. Similarly, we even performed content analysis of some of these messages, and we basically found that the major difference was in the graded condition that students had to provide much more justifications why they were making certain errors, explaining the rationale why that was an error and mistake, connecting it probably with theory. We know that. I mean, in many cases, when we don't explicitly spell out something even inside of our research grants, our reviewers will always assume that we didn't know that, right? And this is a kind of the standard that we always use when we are communicating with other individuals. So these are the now few final remarks before we start discussing. So the point what I want to make is in terms of data collection, who cares about page hits? Unless we have a sound theoretical framework based on which we can provide interpretations for our data. However, we need to be able to collect different types of data that can help us to improve our interpretation and understanding of learning in this wild process, which is completely under control. We need to be able to have contextual measures. For example, what was the instructional condition? Our present LMSs, they don't capture that information. What was the social condition as well? We need to account for the social context in which certain things happen, because those things matter. And then finally, what are those internal conditions? While we are presently guessing, well, this student had lower level metacognitive skills, the other student could have a high level of metacognitive skills, we need to instrument our technology so that we at least understand certain level of intentions of our learners when they are taking annotation. For example, whether they are taking those annotations because they want to get a good grade or because they want to master a particular concept, or whether they are taking this annotation because they think that the particular part of a video was difficult or not, which is grounded in cognitive load measures. This could be now done with learning analytics to do that not only in control experiments, but it could be done in the wilderness. The other thing is, not all the learning is happening inside of the box of these learning management systems. We need to move on and start doing multimodal learning analytics inside the classrooms, inside of even different types of mobile devices that we are taking. And we will be collecting more and more data which are coming from different types of bits and pieces of wearable computing. The other important thing that I emphasized in my talk was these products of learning. They are unstructured. Therefore, for them, we need to typically use qualitative methods. This is the point for the collaboration with computer scientists who can help us to automate the process of analysis of text, who can help us to scale up these coding processes so that we don't have to spend 5 months analyzing 3,000 messages that students produce, but rather we can do that with just one click, right? And that's just basically the place for use of text mining and text analysis. The other thing is importance of the process nature of learning. We need to move on just from simple counts, how many different types of processes happen, but we need to be also engaging into the sequences, how these particular cognitive, metacognitive, or any other types of social contextual processes are happening. And for these types of things, again, in computing, we can offer certain types of things that are coming there. The other important thing is we need to understand, and this is the type of also projects that Gregor is here leading, is related to how we close this loop, how we present some of these analytics to our users, teachers, learners, or any other type of stakeholders. So we did, long time ago, some of the designs of these tools, and we found is that instructors were fine to know, for example, scores of their students, but they really wanted to drill down and understand the exact types of processes that students were engaging into. And we found that the particular 2 types of feedback were very useful for them. One was to understand the level of the specific types of concepts. We call this concept comprehension. Whether students were engaged, for example, in discussion forums, chats, or reading certain pages they posted in their LMSs. They wanted to understand the timeline when that happened. There are certain spikes in time, and also individual concepts, whether they spent enough time in reading. But then, yeah, sure, they spent time in reading, but we know that actually taking notes is something which brings important learning gains. Reading is almost equal to non-reading condition for long-term memory. Anyways, the other type of feedback was these types of social interactions. Students who are isolated in their learning, they're typically also not performing so well. Also, retention models are showing that low level of social integration leads to a higher probability of dropout for students. This basically brings me to the major point is that learning analytics cannot be only done by computer scientists or only done by educational researchers. It's a very, very interdisciplinary field. I cannot engage into this process of learning analytics if although I'm a computer scientist, please have some basic understanding of learning and some of these vocabularies that we can start engaging productively. The other point that I want to make with respect to learning analytics, we should move away from the data-driven paradigm. It's useless. Why? Because it leads us to the concept that we need to use these low-hanging fruits. That is to say, well, we have these data, why don't we use them? Sure, but what questions do you have? Don't use that data if you don't have real questions. So we need to move to the question-driven paradigm. Although, yes, data-driven is good, but data-driven should actually be question-driven. The other important thing is, I'm just going to mention that, ethical and privacy, there are so many things, so I want to just tick this box because it's so important. And I'm sure that many people even here will have strong opinions of that, more than happy to critically interrogate this issue. But the other important thing is, and I think it's very aligned with the ethics and privacy, is basically development of analytics culture. So instead of us, and this is my big worry for analytics or any types of study where eventually we deal with numbers, that a single measure will become the target for us, right? This is also with grades as well. we are skewing so much our education by trying to narrow down learning onto single grade. Okay, fair enough. But now, if we are narrowing down the whole educational process to a single measure of page hits, then instructors will simply create their instructional designs which will be leading their students without any pedagogically useful reason going to those pages. So why bother? This is well known something in economics research. When a certain measure becomes a target, it becomes useless, right? Therefore, we need to rather engage into the process of embracing data and looking how learning analytics can help us to improve our sense-making processes. And this is the metaphor I'm typically using comparing these two movies. One with Brad Pitt and Manny Ball, where they show that analytics and different machine learning algorithms can be very useful to improve composition of teams and improvement of the overall performance in baseball. However, this other movie with Clint Eastwood is basically showing about the trouble with the curve, where very experienced scout recognizes that a certain kid has a problem with the curve. In the beginning, he can't really externalize what was the problem. He knew something was wrong with his kid, although all the stats predictive models show that this could be remarkable performer. This didn't happen. We have so much tacit knowledge in our educational practice and also externalizing our educational research that we need to design sense-making processes but also understand sense-making processes so that analytics becomes a useful tool. At this point, I'm going to stop. Thanks.